Some of the people that make this possible are presenting sponsors of the Frechette Family Foundation and the Town of Vail. Our event sponsors are the Vail Daily, Vail Resorts Epic Promise, and the Antlers at Vail. The underwriters for our summer season, Cindy Ingalls and Leela and Walt Misher. Could we give them all a big round of applause? Normally at the end, I bring the microphone around, but in this current situation, we're going to just ask you to ask your questions out really loudly. Julia is going to repeat the questions so everybody can hear, and we will go on that way, and then I won't be walking around passing this and sharing whatever we might be sharing. So it's now my pleasure to turn things over to our Director of Programming, Claire Noble.
Thanks, Chris. So tonight we're turning our attention also inward, and we welcome Dr. Julia Mosbridge. She's the founder of TILT, the Institute for Love and Time. She's an affiliate professor in the Department of Biophysics and Physics at the University of San Diego. She's an associated full professor in integral and transpersonal psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies and a fellow at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. She received her PhD in Communication Sciences and Disorders from Northwestern University, her MA in Neuroscience from the University of California at San Francisco, and she received her BA with highest honors in neuroscience from Oberlin College. She currently receives funding from the Bial Foundation as well as the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Please help me welcome Dr. Julia Mosbridge.
Hello. Okay, so I have a situation here that I have to let you in on. Yesterday was a really rough travel day for me, and American Airlines still has my bag, which is why I only have one pair of shoes, one travel shirt, and a pair of jeans. And this may be what I'm wearing for the next few days. We shall see. But the other thing that the bag had that was important to me, that forevermore I will always put in my carry-on bag, is my glasses and contacts. And I am nearsighted. So you know that thing where they say to you, just pretend everyone's in their underwear? I can pretend you're just all blobs. And I'm like, oh, I'm talking to blobs. It's very relaxing. But the problem is, over here, someone was waving at me, and I don't know who they were. And other people may be, raising their eyebrows or making some indication of what's going on for them. And if I look at you vaguely in sort of a pleasant way, it means I don't see you, but I'm wanting you to know that whatever you're feeling seems good to me. If I look at you in an unpleasant way, just know that I can't see you at all, and I'm just thinking of something else, okay? So I want you to be aware of all this, and if you owe me money, sit in the back, and I'll never know you were here. Let's see if this is gonna work. Okay, so this is all about precognition, the science of predicting the unpredictable. And this is what most people think about who have seen the movie Minority Report. This is what most people think about precognition. How many people have seen that movie with Tom Cruise? Yeah, so about half of people. So in that movie, there's these 3 precogs that are floating in a vat of goo. And in that vat of goo, they're able to perceive future events. And then for some reason, a ball runs down an inclined plane, and then Tom Cruise catches it and goes and arrests someone before they actually do the bad thing that is being predicted. So it's about pre-crime and stopping crime before it happens as a result of precognition. This is wrong in so many ways, but the number one way this is wrong is that to be precognitive, you don't have to float in a vat of goo. In fact, all of us have some precognitive ability, and that brings me to this list of the top 5 questions people ask me when they know I study precognition. I've been studying precognition for the past 15 years. Originally I studied auditory neuroscience and visual neuroscience and cross-modal cognitive neuroscience and attention, and I got more and more interested in time. So I secretly studied precognition for a while, and then I came out of the closet with a paper that was published in 2012. So anyway, the first question is that people ask is, well, is that a real ability? By which they mean, are people making it up? And hopefully, by the end of this talk, you'll have an answer for yourself. The next is, what kinds of people have that? But of course, what they really want to know, this is the usual airplane conversation, what they really want to know is, do I have that? Right? Can it be learned? If I don't have it, can I learn it? Because it's kind of cool, it's a superpower. How does it work? Well, great question. And how does it change you? Not many people ask this one. It's when I get into the deeper conversations with people about this that they get to the point where they say, wow, it must really change people to learn about precognition. So what am I even talking about? What is precognition? Oh, sorry. Let me go back to this, to the goo. Let me define precognition. Precognition is getting information about the future that you could not know by other means. What are the other means that we normally get information about the future? Well, one is logic. So I predict that the sun is going to rise tomorrow morning. Not precognition, right? Another is memory. If every Monday I remember that I go to work, it's not precognition to think that I'm going to work on a Monday, because now I've remembered the day of the week and the activity, right? And the third thing that allows us to predict the future without precognition is direct cause. So I have a dream about a bowl of chili, and so because I really like chili, I make chili for lunch. So I did that. So I didn't precognize that because I could produce that in my own life. So it has to be something that happens outside of your ability to impact it that you've predicted. So that's precognition, and it can come in many forms, and we'll talk about that. But first, briefly, I want to talk about the questions that I want to put in the back of your mind during this talk that I am not going to really answer very well in this talk, but I want them in the back of your mind because they're the more interesting questions that really motivate this work, and hopefully when we do the question and answer period at the end, you might have some of these and we could talk about them. So they are, and then you might have your own that aren't on this list, but they are: how is precognitive ability related to memory? Does it predict probable or actual events? That's a really important one if you're going to try to, although Claire mentioned that this is a more personal program, you could also, and I'm very interested in, applying precognition to making the world a better place. Like, for instance, we're getting close to the 20th anniversary of 9/11. What if we could have predicted that and done something about it, right? So that's not really a personal question. But it really depends on whether precognition predicts probable or actual events. What does it tell us about free will? What does it tell us about the future and time in general? How can we use it to benefit the world? These are the kinds of questions that I'm hoping you'll have in the back of your mind and that we can discuss. So when we think about time, this is how we're trained to think about the future. People landed on the moon, and the future kind of went on, and then 9/11 happened, obviously not to scale, and then coronavirus happened, and then cars are going to fly eventually someday. Cars will fly, right? We keep hoping. So you have your flying cars. And this way of thinking about the future sort of pretends that the future doesn't exist until it happens. Even 5 minutes from now, we sort of think it doesn't exist until it actually occurs. It's not out there. And then all of a sudden we observe it and we say, now it's happening. The problem with this way of looking at the future, even though that's very common to how we look at it in this culture, is it's not accurate scientifically. For more than 100 years, we've known that it's not accurate, based on special theory of relativity, which tells us that it must be the case that future events exist in what we call the now, because someone who is having a different acceleration or a different experience of gravity might be running into those events, so they have to already exist. So the case is more like this. The case is more like this. It's less intuitive to most of us, but it's more accurate. That our awareness is moving along a landscape of time. And our awareness is saying, oh, now coronavirus is happening. Oh, soon there's going to be flying cars. It's our awareness, it's the mind, it's our experience. It's not physical reality that looks like that. And there's such a difference between those two things, physical reality and the mind, and yet there's an interplay, and so we'll get into that. Okay, so the first two questions I want to work on answering here are, is it real? What's the second one? I'm like really grateful I can read these. They're so blurry. And what kinds of people have it? So let's look at that. So before we look at that, I just want to describe every single precognition experiment that ever existed as far as I know. They're all the same. They're very simple. You record data for some period of time, by which I mean you could record the way someone's breathing, or you could record their heartbeat or their skin conductance, or you could image their brain or do EEG, or you could record what they write down on a piece of paper or a button that they press. It depends on the experiment. That's where the interesting part of the design of the experiment comes in, is what are you going to record? But you're going to record something. Then what? Then you're going to randomly select an event. So this is the event in the future that's going to be precognized. So for example, the future event could be heads or tails on a coin. It could be who wins a particular election or a game. It could be whether you win or lose in your own personal betting war with yourself, which is one that I particularly like, among other things. So you randomly select an event. And then, well, done. I don't know, I just wanted to have a little pause. And then you ask the question, did the data that you recorded before the event predict the event? So you do it a bunch of times. So you use statistics and you say, every time before there was going to be a heads, did the person breathe differently than before there was going to be a tails? And if there was, then that looks like that's what's called a precognitive effect. Because if the event is truly random, how is it, according to our intuitive view but incorrect view of time, how is it that you could have this strong correlation between the thing you recorded before the random event and the actual random event itself, right? So that's, now you understand every precognitive experiment. Good. So now I just want to map for you the different kinds of precognition. And they have different characteristics. I just bring you through this grid. So on the up and down, the vertical y-axis piece here, at the top we have the level of which you're conscious of the content of the precognition. You're aware of what you're precognizing. At the bottom is the extent to which you're unconscious. So these are arranged according, if they're higher, people are more conscious. If they're lower, they're less conscious. On the left, you have short lead time. So the delay between the thing you record and the random event can be short, or it can be long. And so these have different characteristics. So I started, and I'm just going to tell you a little about my journey and why I got interested in this. I started as a kid. My first precognitive dream was at age 7. And I say it was precognitive not because I could prove it in a lab, because I was a 7-year-old kid, but because there were so many correspondences between the content of the dream and the future event. So in the dream, I dreamt that my friend Ishane, so I had the identity of the person, lost her watch, so I had an event, on the playground. So I had a location. And that is what happened the next day. And so I thought, why would I think that, right? Why would that happen? And then I thought, well, I'm a scientific person. It could be that, first of all, the playground's a great place to lose a watch because you're running around a lot. So that's just logical, right? And Ishane had also recently received a watch for a present. And so I thought, all right, well, maybe I was just sort of thinking, maybe she'll lose it because I was jealous, because I wanted a watch, right? And so it just happened. It could be coincidence. So that wasn't proof of anything, but it did get me interested. And more I would have dreams like this, and more I would write in my dream journal and look at correspondences between the dream and the event, and I would see how sometimes there were and sometimes there weren't correspondences. But you can actually do studies in the same kind of way that I just described with dreams, and people have. And it looks like you can find people who dream precognitively accurately. So the time frame on that is minutes to weeks, because sometimes people just wake up from a dream and then the event happens, and sometimes it's weeks later, and it can be years later, but that's rare. All right. Physiological precognition is much shorter, like 500 milliseconds, half a second. Or it can go out to 10 seconds, maybe, depending. But much shorter time frame. And physiological precognition is when your breathing or your skin conductance or your brain, something physiological, is predicting this future event. And let me just give an example of that. The first time I came out of the closet as being interested in this stuff, which turns out to be a big deal in the mainstream science world because there's a taboo against talking about anything that goes in a direction of time that's thought to be unreasonable. I came out of the closet with this paper with this meta-analysis that I did with Jessica Utz and Patrizio Trasoldi, and it got massive number of views and is currently in the 99th, still in the 99th percentile of all papers in that journal. And I'm not telling you that to brag, but I'm telling you that because people are really interested in this. There's not that many scientists who are interested in this, but there's a lot of people who are fascinated by this idea. So that made me think, okay, there's something going on here. And here's just an example of physiological precognition. So in this experiment, at the 0 point here where the arrow is when people were just pressed a button to decide which of 4 images was going to be the winning image. When they won, you see the black curve on skin conductance, which is a measure of arousal. When they lost, you see the red curve. And you can see that the winning and losing separation starts way back here. So they haven't even chosen yet, and their body's getting ready. These are men. Women look different. Tell you more on that later. Behavioral precognition, that's when you press a button, or usually in the lab, it's when you press a button. You're doing some kind of behavior that correlates with the upcoming event. If you saw Daryl Bem on Stephen Colbert, he talked about a bunch of behavioral precognition experiments there. In the middle here is compulsive precognition. That is very hard to measure in the lab. That's the kind of thing you hear about where the mother, for instance, wakes up in the middle of the night and just has to go into the baby's room and finds out that the baby isn't breathing. And she's grateful that she had that, for some reason, had this desire to go. She's not aware of what's going to happen when she goes into the baby's room, but she does it. It's an action. So that's why I call it compulsive precognition, because you're doing an action that sure seems important and related to a future event, but you don't know why you're doing it. That's very hard to study, so I can't tell you good stories about that. In terms of behavioral precognition, this is a paper coming out in the Journal of Anomalous Experience and Cognition. I have this talk in 3 levels, so some folks are going to be very into the nerdy aspects of it. Some folks will be into the high-level aspects of it, and some folks will just be like, well, I'll pick and choose. So just know that you can skip over anything you don't want to pay attention to. But I'm not going to go over this slide, but basically this study replicated that human behavior predicts future events that are otherwise unpredictable, and that there are gender and belief effects that are very complicated. So if you believe that this is the belief effect is not that complicated. If you believe that this is something that works for you, you're more likely to get a higher score. So that's not that complicated. The gender effects turn out to be kind of difficult to understand, and I'm very interested in understanding them. So the next question that seems to come up is, can this be learned? I'm racing through this stuff so we can get to, so I can get a base of understanding here, so I hope that's okay. Are there any quick questions before I move on that you just need to know the answer to in order to keep understanding this? Or are we rolling? We're rolling?
Deja vu, which category in that cross?
Deja vu, oh, this is a great question. Thank you. Deja vu, that should be in the top 5. Deja vu is not precognition necessarily. Deja vu is the experience that's something that you're experiencing, you've just experienced before. And it's not necessarily precognition, because it can be produced by stimulating a part of the brain that makes you feel now that you're having deja vu, which is, in a precognition case, you can't stimulate, as far as we know, a part of the brain that then predicts the future. Maybe someday we'll discover that. But that's a different, you see how that's different in time. It's like backwards versus forwards in time. Yeah. Okay, great. So can it be learned? That's where we're going to go to talk about the learning piece, way up in the corner. And the reason we're going way up in the corner is in order to train people to be more precognitive, you have to make the content of you have to make the information that's coming through in the precognition more conscious. So you have to go to the way far corner to get it more conscious. And also, you need to have a bigger time frame because people learn at a much longer time frame when it comes to conscious information. So seconds to days, to hours, days, weeks. So we're talking about precognitive remote viewing, okay? And I'm going to explain that in a second. Okay, so remote viewing was a method that was developed by the military and the intelligence, mostly the military intelligence and the regular intelligence community in the early 70s. And it's essentially a way to get information across space and time. Much of it was precognitive, but a lot of it was telepathic in terms of getting information from other people. So a brief review of that in case you didn't know about that. And for those who do, I'm sure you'll enjoy this. Physicist David Halputov, who used to work for the National Security Agency, teamed up with another physicist named Russ Targ in 1972 and asked the CIA to fund their project where they were going to train these 6 people and some unselected volunteers. Those 6 people were actually selected on their capacity to basically report information about future events and also telepathic information. So they were already skilled. So these 6 people were trained and to do things like this. The target was describe this site in Europe. It was a research and development site in Europe. And without knowing anything more about the site, you know, Pat Price is one of the stellar remote viewers, comes up with this crane. I don't know why, I'm seeing a crane and it's got wheels and it looks like this. So this is an imitation of that crane right there with a little bit different angles. So this is the kind of work that they would do. So, do you want to ask a question? I heard a whisper, but let's clear it up. Yeah?
So, a lot of times you call people and they'll say, oh, I was just thinking of you.
Yeah.
Is that considered telepathic? Or?
Yeah, so that's one of the really, so there's several very common experiences of psi, which is what people call psychic abilities. One is precognitive dreams. That's probably one of the most common experiences is having a dream of something in the future. Another of the most common experiences is telephone telepathy. And they call it telephone telepathy because it seems that it happens in real time with another person. But it could be precognition. It's very hard to separate those without an experiment. It could be that you're precognizing your telephone call, right? Yeah, Claire.
Sorry, could you just, I'm having a little trouble connecting.
Sure. I am going really fast. And so this is why I was inviting questions, because I was starting to realize, like, yeah, I don't want you hanging on by the seat of your pants. I really want you in this. So, remote viewing was a program where they didn't worry about space or time in terms of the target. So sometimes the target would be describe this thing right now elsewhere, and sometimes the target, in fact, I'll show you a couple examples of where the target, or at least 2 examples of where the target was in the future. It was not segregated out because they quickly learned to, they learned that their people, their folks, Ingo Swann and Pat Price and especially Hella Hammond could basically get information regardless of where in time and space it was. So it suggests, the work on remote viewing suggests that although we segregate so much by time and space, I say, well, I'm inside me and you're inside you, and therefore I can't possibly know what's going on inside you because you're way over there and you haven't told me what's going on inside you, right? Or, you know, the me of the future tomorrow, I can't possibly know what she's experiencing because that's tomorrow. That's how we normally do things and that's how we function. And I get it that that's how we function. It's just that there's evidence that that's not actually the case when you can use these skills. So does that help? Yeah, okay. So that was till 1975. Then Pat Price died. The CIA said, we're done, and turned it over to Ed May's group. Well, Ed May also joined the club with Hal Puthoff and Russ Targ at the Stanford Research Institute. From 1977, I think that says, to 1982, with a couple of projects called Gondola Wish. I'm not saying that that was initiated from an idea of veil, but it's possible. And Grill Flame, which ended up being with the DIA and with the Army. You may have heard of Joe McMoneagle, who was the star viewer who joined then. And then just a brief history, in 1983, the Project Centerlane, same work, except now the Army decided not only did they want to screen people, and they wanted to train people who didn't show necessarily that much promise. Now they wanted to train them and get operational, to do more operational work of intelligence out in the world. So Ingo Swann is highlighted there because he was the trainer. So here we have Bill Ray, Paul Smith, I was at Ed Dames up front, Ingo Swann, Tom McNair, and Charlene Kavanaugh-Schufeld. So that's that group. And then from 1985 to 1995, you had these names are just silly, but Dragoon, Absorb, Sunstreak, and Stargate. In 1995, it went back to the CIA, who killed the program. Okay, so this is the $20 million of funding over the years 1972 to 1995 that were spent on this program. Much of this was precognitive without discussing it, but in the final document that the CIA used to kill the program, one of the things they kept mentioning, this is in case you're interested, it's called the AIR document. I think Advanced Institute of Research or something like that. I can never remember what AIR stands for because it stands for so many things. But anyway, they mentioned about 6 or 7 times that precognition was statistically and repeatedly shown to be one of the most replicable skills. So that was interesting. And here's just an example of one of the remote viewing sessions. This is too small for me to read, but they're setting up here exactly who knows what information and who's being told what about this ship that they want information about. These are declassified. And so the session starts on a certain day, like it looks like 12 of December 1980, and there's a person who is the monitor or the experimenter who's sitting in a room with the person who's the remote viewer. The remote viewer has already meditated and gotten ready for the session, and the experimenter is asking them, okay, well, here's a picture of a ship, focus on the ship, go a couple days in the future, what's the ship doing now? What direction is it turning? What's going on the ship? Go another day in the future. What direction is the ship turning now, etc. And so this comes up with this kind of intelligence where you actually see a map of the future, the path of the ship, north, in the north, south, east, west coordinates, which is a really interesting way to do things. It's not the way I would do things now, but it's an interesting method, and it was done multiple times, and you could see this in the declassified documents. So let's see, 11 July 1980. So this is a letter from the Joint Chiefs of Staff to Colonel Puste, I guess, in the U.S. Air Force about the Grill Flame Project, which is the project related to getting information between 1983, whatever was on that earlier slide, and 1985. So I'm going to see if I can read this. Application of Project Grill Flame to the Iranian hostage situation was actively initiated by DA during mid-November 1979. Sufficient correlation of physical verifiables has been obtained to indicate that Grill Flame data appears to provide insights that would not be readily available through other sources, particularly when working against a target in a denied or hostile environment. In summary, Grill Flame appears to have potential value when used as a supplemental or keying source. Any decisions based solely on Grill Flame material, however, would be extremely risky and not recommended. So the Joint Chiefs are recommending using this information not as the only information, but as an adjunct to existing intelligence, which I think is really cool. The reason I put that up there is just because I have certain friends who were, or colleagues who were viewers during that time, and they talk about how this was the most successful project. They were able to psychically identify all of the hostages, including 3 CIA agents who were there, and the CIA didn't know they were there. So Jessica, and again, the reason that relates to precognition is that there's a possibility that all of that is done precognitively. In other words, looking into the future to see who comes home and then reporting on who was there. So Jessica Utz, who was the American Statistical Association president in 2016 and also was a co-author of mine, said in 1996, after she was hired by Congress to review all of this work that the government had paid for, she said precognition, in which the answer is known to no one until a future time, appears to work quite well. So since 1996, we have known this. And it's very hard to find someone who disagrees with it, who knows the literature, because it keeps being the case the more and more you do these experiments. So it becomes not the question of, is this real? It becomes a question of, what's going on? How's it working? And these experiments in the military and intelligence showed that you can actually train people. So this brings me to another example. When I was first starting out running teams of remote viewers, as a remote viewer myself, I learned to do it because I wanted to understand what they were doing. And I got called by some folks in Hawaii who's lost their, I got called by the boyfriend of Amanda Eller in Maui, and she got lost and they couldn't find her and they were checking out multiple psychics. And I said, well, I'll run the team. And the way I do things is I do it precognitively. So we'll go ahead and don't tell me anything about her, if you can, because people like to share, about their person that they're missing, of course. Don't tell me anything about her and I'll see, what I can get. And then in the future, you'll tell me. And then that will help me know how my precognition is working and that on my team. So we did that. And we ended up being able to tell the family that she was in the east side of the island, which is where she was. But in the process, I learned a lot. And one of the things I learned is that when someone's missing or they need your help, you need to educate the family about their own ability to use their intuition. Because the family kept reaching out to all these psychics, but they were very intuitive. And so helping them, coaching them on calming down and using their intuition, I think would be very helpful. Same with law enforcement. The other thing we learned is to not expose the task too quickly to the viewers. So not to tell them too quickly, this is a missing persons case. The more information that the viewers have as they're doing it, the more they'll start filling in the blanks with their logical mind. Oh, she's been abducted. Oh, da-da-da-da-da-da. Right? All these stories. But when they don't have the capacity to know that they're even working on a missing persons case, they're actually giving you better information. It's the opposite of what, when I worked with the FBI, the opposite of what they would do in an investigation. They would say, don't you want me to tell you the gender at least of the person? Don't tell me anything, because I'll make up some story with my logical mind about what's going on. Another thing I learned is don't use unknown viewers, only use viewers that I've worked with before. That was a mistake. Also, to make a task where the viewers have to answer the question, where will she be found in the future? Not where is she now? Because with missing people especially, if you find out where they are now, who cares? In 10 minutes, they could be someone can move them, right? They could be in a different place. They can move themselves. So when we tasked where will she be in the future, the viewers started sketching these helicopter wings that I misinterpreted as solar, no, not solar, windmills?
Urban turbines.
Thanks. When I get in the mode where I'm thinking about remote viewing, my brain goes very right brain and it's hard for me to find words. When I get in the scientific mode, I'm in that other mode. So I'm going to be switching back and forth. But yes, wind turbines. So I thought they were wind turbines which took us to a different part of the island. When I realized, of course, they're going to be drawing a helicopter because in this part of the island, the only way someone could get down to rescue her would be with a helicopter. That made me understand what was going on. So trust your known viewers. And I also learned analysis matters and hope matters. So all of those things were true. We can talk about those later. So then people ask, how does it work? Is this mind or is this matter? So first, let's talk about the mind explanation. So this is a paper coming, oh no, this paper has already come out. What we did was we were interested in the mental aspects of remote viewing. That's one of the things we were interested in, and especially how it relates to unconditional love. Now, I can talk for days about unconditional love, but unconditional love we defined this way. Unconditional love is the heartfelt, benevolent desire that everyone and everything, ourselves, others, and all that exists in the universe, reaches their greatest possible fulfillment, whatever that may be. This love is freely given with no consideration of merit, with no strings attached, with no expectation of return, and it is a love that motivates supportive action in the one who loves. The bottom is cut off, but that's what that says. So we defined unconditional love that way, and that allowed us to measure it. So we showed everyone the definition and said, how much are you feeling this right now? It was a simple way to measure it, right? How much are you feeling it towards yourself? How much are you feeling it towards your partner or spouse? How much are you feeling it towards a person on the street? How much are you feeling it towards animals? How much are you feeling it toward the device on which you are completing this survey? Those were the questions, something like that, right? So we could measure that before people were able to go and get a hypnotic suggestion to experience even more unconditional love. And what we found was the people who self-reported low feelings of unconditional love operated about at chance. In other words, they were not very good at a precognitive remote viewing task, according to 2 independent judges who didn't know which target was being drawn by these people when they would do their little sketches of the future target. Those who self-reported having a lot of experience of unconditional love not only scored above chance, so they did better on the remote viewing session, but they also clearly scored better than those who had the low unconditional love. So this is a first demonstration of that idea. So I'm working on a replication. So this is sort of like take home as an interesting possible message, and we'll see if it replicates. Okay, let's talk about the matter piece. So that was the mind piece, the unconditional love piece. Let's talk briefly about the matter piece. Okay, I didn't put this on the map before because it's not a human or animal version of precognition, but there's something that I like to call augmented or artificial precognition, which is where you use a machine to predict the future. Now, this comes from the idea that, bless you, this comes from the idea that if we are able to get information from the future, which precognition does seem to show us that we can, there must be some process underlying it that we could actually potentially automate. So let's look at that. Before we look at that, I briefly need to describe these 2 concepts. Retrocausality. Retrocausality is a causal relationship in which a cause comes after an effect, which sounds like impossible, but that's what retrocausality is. So usually we say, I stamp my foot and then you hear the sound, right? But if you heard the sound and then I stamped my foot, you would think the movie was running backwards. That's retrocausality. I do not think that causality is necessarily a real thing. I don't think that causes necessarily exist, and I'm among several scientists who, in a growing field, that think that causality is something we make up but isn't really physical. So I call this causal ambiguity. So this is the idea that there's a very tight correlation between 2 events. I missed the word between there. There is no clear distinction between cause and effect. So there's not retrocausal or forward causal. It's just ambiguously causal. In other words, very correlated events. So to test out the idea if you could create some kind of physical model of causal ambiguity or retrocausality, I just took some photons and ran them in a optical system and wrote this paper about the results, which look like this. Here's what's going on. At this point, which is about a minute into, I guess this was 30 seconds, into the lamp being on, that's the time where the dotted line is, where I had the computer randomly decide what the future duration would be of the experiment. So it sounds weird, but at this point, it's just like a precognition experiment. Record something, have a random event, let it go, and then see if what comes before the thing the random event, you see if that's correlated with the random event. Now you can see here, look at the yellow one, that's the longest one that goes on for like 10 minutes. You see what's coming before that? You see how the number of photons is significantly far above those other durations? That's before the event is chosen. And I've run this experiment now for about 2 years, and I keep getting this result, so I'm pretty convinced. And then a friend at Berkeley ran it with much better equipment because he got to use the Berkeley physics lab equipment and got similar results. So we just announced that recently. So again, it's just another demonstration that there's something going on here where the future information is sort of leaking back in time in ways that we don't normally detect unless we do certain experiments. Okay, that's the matter piece. What about mind and matter together? So what I think is going on, yes, question?
Can you just go back to that slide, and maybe I'm not capturing it, but what's the green and the blue line?
Yeah, so the parameter here that's different between the colors is just the duration, and you can literally see the differences in duration. So the x-axis is time. The number of observations of the photons.
It's 3 different instances.
It's 3 different durations. Oh, I ran this 500 times. This is the mean of those 500. There's 3 different durations that you're seeing. There's actually 4 durations, but one of them overlaps and is very short. But what you can see from there is going to be 3 different durations. Does that make sense? No? What doesn't make sense about it?
Explain about the protons.
Photons. Oh, excuse me. Photons that's light, right? So light particles / waves, that's photons. Protons have mass. That's not what I'm talking about here. So the y-axis is the mean photomultiplier count of the number of photons. What does that mean? The photon comes down the tube. It's just a big, like a meter length tube. There's a little lamp, 15-watt bulb. It goes down the tube, and it's counted by what's called a photomultiplier, which kicks out an electron for the photons and then amplifies the number of amplifies the photons via kicking off more electrons so that you could actually count them. So this is the number of photons counted, and this is the number of observations. And this red line is where the duration is predicted. So with a longer duration, it's like it's getting ready for it to be a longer duration by already having more photons there. It's the same exact result as the one I showed you with physiology, except now we're talking about photons. You see? It's the same. In fact, I've done the similar experiment using pH in chemistry, right? And you get the same result. So it's like, this is the same experiment over and over again. I'm running the same experiment for years. and this is the result, that you can get information from the future. Whatever the system is, if you do this experiment and you do it well, you can get that information. Does that make sense? I'm not saying does it make sense intuitively, because I know it doesn't. But does it make sense the words I'm saying? Yeah? Okay. I can't see your expression, so I don't know if you have this expression of like, I'm appalled, or like, yes, I get it.
So just in simple terms, what's it proving? What is proving that?
So nothing in science ever proves anything, right? But it's providing evidence for the idea that there are ways to get information about future events. So that's all it's doing. But there's never proven, right? Because someone could come along and say, I had done something wrong, or not only was there a methodological problem, but the interpretation was wrong. So everything's always in flux. Thank God, because otherwise science would be boring. So, but my best interpretation that no one has been able to shoot down yet is that you're getting information about the future. Yeah. So that's the matter piece, because photons are considered matter in the sense that they're energy, right? So matter and energy. So my thought is that there's this mind and matter piece. So let's talk about mind and matter together. What does that look like? I think it looks like this, and this gets to that other question of how does time work and what does it tell us about the future? So you see you have the present here, the future going that way, the past as if it goes that way. And at the present, what distinguishes the present is that the past and the future are sort of intermingling signals, and actually singly intermingling signals. So let me explain that a little better. Let's see, who here has read Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, Daniel Kahneman? Okay, in Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, the behavioral economist who won a Nobel Prize, Daniel Kahneman, wrote about how we have these 2 systems that we work with in our minds. One is system 1, which he calls system 1, which is a little bit difficult to remember because the next one's system 2, and if you forget what they are, then you're going to flip them. But system 1 is the fast one. In a way, it's easy because it comes first. It's fast, it's intuitive, it comes to quick conclusions. It's just like bubbling up from your subconscious. It's when you're driving and all of a sudden you go, oh, I have to veer to the left. That's system 1. System 2 is the deliberative system. The one that says, oh, I don't know, should I get this cell phone or this cell phone? Show me all the pieces of the cell phone and I'll tell you which one I want to get. System 1 and system 2. So I have this hypothesis this is where the mind part comes in with the matter. I think this is what's going on physically. But the mind part, I have this hypothesis that system 2, the deliberative system, is dealing with information that's going forward in time. So what we traditionally think of how time works, we're going to predict the future based on the past. That's what system 2 says. System 1, I think, is actually dealing with information coming from the future. But it's subconscious, which is why we doubt that it exists. Why we could only get evidence of it by doing these kind of experiments that actually dig into subconscious responses by using either behavior or physiology, right? Or photons, which are really subconscious because they're not inside of us. Well, I guess they are. So I think of it as these turtles here. System 1, when it's trying to process information in the forward direction in time, it's kind of like it could only process the internal sort of staring at your belly button. I could only deal with what's in my local environment. I'm not Turtle 2, who is System 2, the deliberative system dealing with the forward processing. It's swimming along doing exactly what it needs to do with all the materials it needs. It's doing the right thing at the right time because it's working with the data, the information that it's built to work with. And then I think you have the exact same situation down here, but flipped. So when you get information from the future, basically you're processing in reverse. System 1, the one that's the intuitive, quick thinking fast, is actually like, yes, I'm in my sweet spot. I know exactly what to do with this information from the future, and I'm ready to go, and I'm actually very skilled with it, and I'm more accurate, but we don't usually listen to that. And system 2 just cannot deal with that information from the future. So that's why our conscious deliberative process is like, that doesn't exist. I'm going to hide in my shell. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't believe any of the data. And so for decades, people can present this data. And system 2 says, no way, thank you. So that brings me to this. How does this change you? And this part, how are we doing with time? What's how much? Okay, great. I'm going to bring you through how does it change you, and then we can talk more about that. Fast. This is me when I was like 5. This is me trying to fly when I was about 7. Also trying to fly with my sister when I was about 12. And this is me sitting in front of my little time machine optical system, I don't know, a couple months ago. So the way we normally think about time is like that. Slices. This is me when I was 3, this is me, et cetera. This is what happens when you do a lot of work practicing precognition, is you think of your life from the beginning to the end and beyond, right? This whole stream as one unit. It's like beads on a string. And so the experience is very much one of strengthening your sense of who you are, because you're not just this one moment in time. You're not just what you can see right now. You're also the 3-year-old self and the 12-year-old self and the 30-year-old self and the 40 and the 60 and the self that's lying on your deathbed. So there's a way in which it's like the physicists talk about the world line of a particle. The world line of a particle is the spot in space and time from when the particle was at first emitted, so when it was born, to when it's absorbed, so when it essentially dies. And it could go from here and around the world and over here, and that's kind of the full definition of the particle. Well, why should we be any different, right? There's something that changes internally, not cognitively, not at the level of system 2, but at the level of system 1, that happens when you practice this over and over again. And when you start to consciously connect with your future self. And it's this world line kind of thinking. And it reminds me of this. This is a plot of where your eyes go when you look at a painting. So when you look at a painting, you can't see the painting all at once. You think you do because your visual memory remembers where you looked, and you start to put it together, all the pieces, and you start to think of it as a whole. But you actually can't see it all at once. So this is really what you're doing. These numbers show where most people look, first, second, third, fourth, etc. You create the experience of the painting, just like the experience of your life, out of that entire expanse. So there have been multiple studies that say your connection with your future self can be strengthened with practice. It leads to increased future orientation and hope and improves well-being. So I think of it as like this. If you're flying with your future self, you're stronger than when you're flying alone. Or with your past self. We could add that in. And here's a cool study, upshot. People have greater life satisfaction 10 years in the future. This is about 5,000 people. People have greater life satisfaction 10 years in the future when they felt 10 years ago in the first measurement, when they felt that they were close to their future self, that they were very much like their future self, when they felt like they liked their future self. Regardless of what their life satisfaction was in the first measurement, they had better life satisfaction on the second measurement when they had that close relationship. This is a case study that I can tell you about if you're interested, but it's one person, so I'm not going to go into it because I don't have time. And this is key. So in our life, the y-axis, we have ups and downs. So let's look at the blue line here. Every single person on the planet goes like this through your life. I don't care who you are, you have ups and downs, right? So the question is, how are you going to handle it? This is time. If you handle it this way, by averaging, all those yellow dots are the sort of the sense of who you are. If you collapse over time the sense of who you are so you can average together all those experiences, you have this sort of pretty decent well-being because you're not being tugged down when you go down, and you're not being raised up like crazy when you're feeling, wonderful. But if you can add unconditional love to that mix, which means you're not only remembering who you are over time, but actually loving who you are over time, your well-being goes way up. Because now you're forgiving your past self for things that you regret, and you're loving your future self for all the help that it's giving you. So, this is interesting and cool. We can get back to that. We did this cool experiment called Time Machine. And the upshot was this. I don't want to show any more graphs because I know that cognitive overload here. But we had a group of 96 people, half of who had really high adverse childhood experiences. And that's high ACEs, and half who had low ACEs. And you can see on the second day of the study when we measured overall well-being, there's a huge difference. People who had early childhood experiences that were very adverse, had lower overall well-being. That's a known fact. But over the 26 days of the study, where we asked them to record a message to connect with their future self, their well-being actually matched exactly that of people who had much better childhoods, which we think is really cool because it's hard to do that. And unconditional love mediated that relationship. Okay, so let's go back to our top 5 questions. Is precognition a real ability? Yes. What kinds of people have it? All kinds, but gender, belief, and personality shape it. Can it be learned? Yes. But innate talent actually helps, just like with music, right? How does it work? Probably informational plus mental plus physical components. We don't know. How does it change you? If you're using unconditional love, for the better. And then, again, just a reminder of these other questions that are important to ask that we didn't answer. And just to contrast the original movie that I showed with the Minority Report, this is the way precognition actually works. This is from the movie Arrival. And you have Amy Adams playing this scientist who's a linguist, and she has to decode alien language that looks like this circle of ink, basically, these weird heptapod aliens. And the deal with the language is because everything that they're saying is they're saying it once, she has to start comprehending all the beads on the string. And that changes her brain, so she starts getting precognitive information about the future that ends up saving the world from horrible destruction. This is my nonprofit, tiltloveandtime.org, so you can check it out. And I just want to, I kind of obviously really just whizzed through all that stuff. So if you have questions about it, we can talk about it. And I just want to thank Claire and everyone here at the Vail Symposium, also the folks in my sponsoring institutions, University of San Diego, California Institute of Integral Studies, TILT and IONS, as well as funders, Quantum Gravity Research, Hummingbird Foundation, Bial Foundation, Jeff and Leslie Olsner, Windbridge Institute, Right Hemispheric, Experiment.com, and also the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is also my largest funder, but I somehow forgot to put them on here, so also thank you to them. And thank you, everyone, for being patient with all this information. I know it was a lot, so let's do some questions and answers. Please ask, yes, because I can't see you, so whatever expression you're making.
So how does that help you every day with your life? How do you use that? How do you feel the fact that available? And is that free will?
Repeat the question.
Yeah, so the question is, I think I understand the question. The first question I understand, which is, how does that affect you in your daily life to have that ability? And then there's the second question maybe is,
Yeah, is that a free will?
is that free will? Is the question? Okay. So the first question, how does it impact me? And then I think I'll try to answer it for what I've noticed from people I teach and other people. But personally, how it affects me is I use my system one thinking, my intuitive thinking, in integration with my deliberation thinking. So they're much more integrated, and I think I allow my system one more, my intuitive thinking more than I think on average people do, especially on average as scientists do. And at the same time, my system two thinking has improved because I'm able to just use my system two thinking for what it needs to be done in the world. So let me put that in a practical way. I am much more in flow. So like the fact that I've never had to give a lecture when I couldn't actually see people or things. and it's okay because I connect with my future self and I know that it'll work out fine. So it's not so bad, so that's an example. In terms of how the precognitive stuff affects me, it's very similarly. So doing precognition, precognitive remote viewing it's like meditating on steroids. It majorly impacts your capacity to know your own mind and your own sense of who you are and your own sense of purpose. So that's how it has impacted me. And I think that's largely how it's impacted my students and others I know who are in the field and doing this. Is that free will? I think free will is, I think how people think of free will is that I can choose what I do and I can control it. I always am a little curious about free will because I don't really think that any of us controls, 100% of what we do, right? We have all these influences, like what did you have for breakfast and are you tired and are you sick, right? These are things that we don't control, or often, our physiology we don't feel we control. If who we're defining as we is the conscious self. But if we're going to define as we or I, if I say I have free will, if we're going to define as I or we, my conscious self plus this whole non-conscious expanse of who I am, then I say you have free will because that includes a lot more. That includes kind of the rest of the universe, right? And so then you have free will because it includes everything. And so all those calculations the universe is doing to make the next step somewhere are part of you. So it kind of depends on how you identify yourself. And I think that speaks to, and it's interesting you ask those questions together, it speaks to the fact that when you do this kind of work, you start to identify yourself as larger than one small person. Because you're not just your conscious mind, which is like slow and kind of plodding. You're this like expansive, much faster operating, much more aware being. Yeah, does that make sense? Cool. All right, person with the white shirt.
I saw you had to run through it, but you had a slide of the transformation and
It wasn't the Seneca Nation, it was the Iroquois. So, yeah, you want me to just briefly say that? Yeah. Excellent.
What was the association?
Yeah, so the Iroquois, they lived in these long houses where like 14 to 16 families would, and I think some still do in the northeast United States and Canada, where 14 to 16 families would live together. So a real community of families. And there was this idea of the long body where, the tools that you use every day and your ancestors and your children and anything that, you touch a lot and you interact with, anything you're kind of entangled with over your lifetime is part of your long body, right? And extend that through time, we would have the long body in time. And so then I showed a slide of William Roll who talked about how psychic abilities or precognition could be seen as the long body in time. And in fact, you may have read Eric Wargo's book, Time Loops, maybe not, but also his next book is called Precognitive Dream Work and the Long Body, or the Long Self. So this idea is coming back from the Iroquois. They're also the 7th generation people. This idea is coming back about the connecting with yourself and others over time as part of your body. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What does this have to do with manifesting?
What does this have to do with manifesting?
Yeah.
I don't think it has anything to do with manifesting. So here's the deal with manifesting. I have a different opinion than just about everyone else in the consciousness community about manifesting. So the idea of manifesting is like, it seems to me the idea of manifesting is that you know what is going to be best for you and you're going to make it happen. And my observation is that people don't know what's going to be best for them. And thank God you don't get everything that you want. Because that would be a disaster. So manifesting, I think, is kind of a mistake. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you studied twins and the relationship of, connection between their minds and their...
Yeah, twin telepathy. I am really all about time. I'm super fascinated by time. But what's interesting to me is that as I teach people precognition and I work on my own precognition, my telepathy clearly gets stronger. So it does seem like there's some kind of relationship between, and I ignore it because I'm like, no, I'm focused on this time thing, But it does seem like there's some kind of relationship between getting more connected with yourself over time that translates to it's like being connected with someone over space. Like you learn the time and you go to space, or you learn space and you go to time. So this is unsurprising because there's this kind of an interesting relationship between time and space in physics. And so that's intriguing to me. But I don't do those experiments. Rupert Sheldrake would be one to look up who does the twin telepathy experiments. And there's a researcher in Oregon whose name Gene Achtenberg, I think, who does some of that twin or close partner telepathy stuff. Really interesting stuff. Yeah. Yeah. White shirt person.
Well, this, for one thing, this gives me a new perspective on something I find myself saying a lot, which is I'm just going to trust the universe.
Yeah.
Because I am that.
Yeah.
Already, and trusting that future self-transaction.
Yeah.
My question is a little bit more about capturing this. I'm wondering, A, do children who already still have that unconditional loving heart seem to have a better knack at this? And B, my own child was very prescient, very precognitive, and then had several really bad experiences around puberty of seeing and reading
Of people dying.
and the horrible crimes that actually happened at our house. But she dreamt it 3 months in a row, 3 times,
Mm-hmm.
and then it happened.
Yeah.
So she shut it down
Yeah.
because it's not a good thing for her. It doesn't feel good.
Right.
People die, crimes happen.
Yeah. Okay, let me repeat the question here. So there's 2 kind of questions. The first question, great questions. The first question was children, because they're more in that unconditionally loving space. Would they be better at this? And then second, talking about your daughter and sort of shutting it down because it was scary. So I'm so glad you asked those questions. So the first one, so we sort of think of children as being unconditionally loving. I'm not convinced. I mean, if we define unconditionally loving as wanting the best thing for all involved in the world, I think that's a very mature stance. And I think kids seem like, gaga and stuff when you're about to like breastfeed them or whatever. And then when you're when you say, hey, no, you can't have that thing, they're no longer in that state. So, so I don't know that there's a relationship, although I do think kids are generally more capable, or more kids are, let me put it this way, the data seem to suggest that kids talk about those kind of experiences more. Honestly, though, I mean, I don't know that they're having them more. I think it might be about at the same level as adults. When I give talks to scientists or academics, at the end, often they'll come up to me and say, it's okay if you leave, I'm not gonna be offended. They'll come up to me and say, I have to have a private audience with you. Multiple academics in one talk. And I'll say, well, you're all coming up to tell me that, and I know you're all just gonna tell me some kind of experience you had that you can't explain, and you wanna know if you're crazy. And why don't we all just talk together? But there's a taboo about adults talking about this stuff that the kids don't have as much. And part of that taboo comes from this experience that some kids who are particularly gifted in precognition will have, which is you dream about something bad, and you dream exact details, and then that thing happens. And then you have two thoughts, like, one, did I do it? Did I cause it? Because kids start to think they're the center of the universe, and maybe they caused it, and adults certainly can think that too. And the other is, well, even if I didn't cause it, should I have done something to prevent it? Like, should I have done more? And so one thing that's really important to me is changing the culture around this stuff, because if we're going to be all taboo around it, then the kid who has that experience has parents who are afraid to go tell other people about the experience, and they don't know how to be with the kid around it, and they can't find a psychologist to help with those feelings, because it's all like, you're crazy, you made it up, da-da-da-da, right? And so shifting the culture so that we can talk about this as an actual skill, and instead we say to a kid like that, wow, you know, it is not your fault that this happened, and you didn't have to do anything other than what you did, and even if you didn't mention the dreams, it would be okay. And let's talk about all the feelings that happened there, and let's talk about how important this gift might be to the world, and resources that you can use to, that next time you have a dream, you could actually report it on a international database of dreams that people have, that where we could actually use artificial intelligence to predict future events based on these. I mean, like, clearly there are some things that you could do that aren't that hard to think about, that would make the world a place where these skills could be actually used to help humanity, rather than to people shut it down again and again and again because it's negative.
Those resources on your website?
Oh, you're pretending that those things I said exist? No, that's what I'm saying. No, this is the goal, right? We're at the very beginning stages of people starting to get it, that this is not crazy. I mean, only in the last version of DSM did they start to talk about that if your client believes in precognition or telepathy or clairvoyance, and they cite the scientific evidence, they might not be nuts, right? That's the only very recent version, and that's like still considered very controversial. So we're getting there. Thank you for those questions. Other questions? Fun stuff. Way in the back.
Have you studied IQ? Does that affect people's level of precog?
That's a great question. I have not studied IQ. The IARPA, the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Agency, has a super forecasters competition that was, I think, started by Philip Tetlock, maybe, who basically they're trying to screen people for the capacity to predict future events generally based on logic, like, a bunch of people who are really good at figuring out where the yen will be in 2 years or when on a particular date based on world changes. It's possible those people are using precognition. I think that a lot of the really good ones are using precognition and they don't know it. And IQ, the reason I'm telling you this is IQ was linked to the capacity to be what they call a super forecaster. So people who are really good at this are super forecasters. So higher your IQ, the better of a super forecaster you could be. But there are many other factors like openness and your capacity to change your mind when you got new data and things like that. Those things are also very important. I think probably more important than IQ is creativity and your capacity to not believe yourself all the time. Yeah. Yeah.
So is Deja Vu precognition?
Okay, so is Deja Vu precognition? Yeah, this was asked earlier, but it gets confusing, so I'm going to say it again. The thing about Deja Vu is the theory is there's a part of your brain that kind of marks the incoming information with a stamp that says, 2 stamps. This is what I experienced, and it's now familiar. 2 stamps. This is what I experienced, and it's familiar. But if it doesn't mark those correctly, you can get something that comes in that just gets the "this is what I experienced" stamp, but not the "this is familiar" stamp. So then when you remember it just a moment later because it just happened, you think it's not familiar, but it's familiar, right? So that's sort of the reverse of deja vu. And then deja vu is where you're now stamping something that comes in that you haven't yet consciously experienced, right? As familiar. So now you go, it's familiar, and then there it is again, it's familiar. And the second time it's more resonant than the first because now you're actually experiencing it. Did that make any sense? I feel like I messed that up worse than the first time.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you say it the first time.
Oh yeah, that was a better explanation. No. Let's just reverse, yeah, so basically, precognition, you're knowing something about the future. Deja vu says, I've already experienced this in the past. So it's like the different direction in time. Yeah.
Can I just add on to that? Like,
Yeah.
so, you know, like I've had an experience where it's like, I was like, oh, like 10 years ago, like I'm in this experience.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, this was a dream. I know what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
You know, so is that a precognitive dream that now you're experiencing this and you already know what's going to happen like the next 10 seconds?
Yeah, so the question is that experience, I've had that too. I bet, how many people in this room have had this experience where like in the next 10 seconds I know what's going to happen? Yeah. Yeah, it's extremely common. It's probably about as common as precognitive dreaming, which makes me think maybe it is a precognitive dream that you either don't remember or you do remember, but you can't remember fully because it was 10 years ago.
Yeah.
You know, maybe?
And then you're like, okay, I know this person's going to come at me now and ask me about something.
Yeah, then the person's going to walk over there and then they're going to drop the thing. But another piece of it, so it could be precognition, or again, it could be misordering of things in your brain in terms of the time that they're coming in. So you think you're precognizing it, but you're not. So that's why deja vu is really interesting to study, but you can produce it in the brain, right, by stimulating certain neurons, or certain circuits. But that's kind of the best way to study it, because otherwise it's spontaneous like this, and it's very different. When I say the best, it's just because I'm an empiricist, I like to do experiments. But you could do a study where you ask people questions about it and learn a lot. So, yeah, Chris?
Can you give just a simplified example of something that actually happened that was precognition?
For me?
And what you did with it, or what you could do with it?
Sure. My favorite examples are compulsive precognition, because that's when the system's working so well you don't even have to worry about it. So I'll give a compulsive precognition. This example's in this book that I wrote with Teresa Chung that I promised I would point out. If you're coming to the workshop on Saturday, you'll get a copy of this book.
What's it called?
The Premonition Code. I'm not great at the marketing thing. I always forget to say the name of the book. Teresa Chung's my co-author. It's called The Premonition Code. And there's a website, by the way, called The Premonition Code. And you can go there and you can learn how to do precognition for free. And I spent a lot of time making that experiment so I could get thousands of data points from around the world, and that's been pretty cool. So, having said that, my experience that I talk about in that book, that's a compulsive precognition experience, is I'm in the kitchen in Evanston, Illinois, and my husband, who was my boyfriend at the time, we weren't married yet, was in the process of what I thought was going to happen was, one part of me thought was going to happen is he was going to die because he couldn't breathe anymore. He was down to something like 50% oxygen when he didn't have his oxygen tank. And so he was always on oxygen, and we didn't know what was going on with his lungs. And so he was sitting in one chair, and I was making something in the kitchen, and my son comes home from school. And my son rides his bike home from school, and I see him pass by the kitchen window, lock up the bike, or put the bike in the garage, and then come back to the kitchen and say, I'm home, can I have some food or something? And I got really cross with him, which I usually wasn't at that stage. And I got really just upset at him, and I said, you don't take care of your things. You didn't check to see if your bike was locked in the garage. And he's like, what? First of all, how do you know that? The garage is over there. You can't even see it. 2, why is this an issue? It's not like we live in a horrible neighborhood. We didn't live in a great neighborhood, but I don't think anyone was going to go into our garage, but I was so upset. I got really, really upset, and I couldn't even blame it on menopause at that point. So it was really frustrating to me because I didn't know why I was yelling at him. And finally, my boyfriend says to me, Jules, just go to the garage yourself. Like, why are you giving him such a hard time? You have some weird thing going on with the garage. And I was like, ah. So I said, no, Joseph, you go. And so he went first, and he came back. He's like, it's locked. So I go, I'm still upset at you. I still don't think you're taking care of your bike. And so it's completely insane. So I leave the kitchen, and I go out to the garage, and the garage door is locked, and his bike is locked. And I'm like, oh, oh, I'm a bad mom. And I go back in the house, and there's a fire on the side of the house where the electricity monitor is. It's just on fire. And it's right on the other side of my boyfriend's oxygen tank. So his oxygen tank is right on the other side of the wall. And I'm like, oh, now I know why I needed to go to the garage. Now I know why I was so inappropriately upset, is because I needed to get out there and turn off the electricity and call the fire department and get my boyfriend's oxygen tank away from the other side of the wall. And so that's an example of compulsive precognition. It's like you do something out of the ordinary. It wouldn't be your normal thing. Another example is I know a guy who was in Iraq, and it's very hot, and he wants a particular kind of iced tea. And it's ridiculous because his actual workstation is sitting on top of a cooler that contains all this water. And he's like, I could just have the water. The iced tea is like way over there. So he's like, no, I really want the iced tea. And so he argues with himself, and finally he gets up, he walks and goes and gets the iced tea. And then he comes back, and his whole area is shut down because an IED went off right next to where he was sitting. Okay, so he's like, oh, I guess that's why I wanted the iced tea. So there's lots of stories like this from military folks because it sort of screens you for the capacity to survive, right? Those who survive often have this trait. Any other questions? Yeah, Claire.
So you mentioned that people who scored low on unconditional love were not as good
Right.
as people who scored higher.
Right.
And then you also mentioned the study that you guys conducted with children who had had difficult childhoods and how you kind of moved the dial on them.
Yes.
So did you help cultivate unconditional love in them? And if
Yes.
so, how did you do that?
So the question is, if you actually help cultivate unconditional love in people, first of all, how do you do that? Does it make them more precognitive? You didn't ask that, but I'm asking that. In the study that I showed, the Time Machine study, which is the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation study, where we just created a technology to help people literally like leave text messages for themselves in the future, right? It's just a simple, but we prompted them about how to love themselves as they're listening to the message. These are adults, these are not children. We measured their trauma histories by using the Adverse Childhood Experience Survey, which is those ACEs scores that you saw. So these are adults with traumatic childhoods. They come in, and the folks who had really traumatic childhoods with lots of abuse, neglect, et cetera, are the ones whose overall well-being is significantly lower than the ones who had less of that, as you would expect, right? That's why we think about childhood as affecting your life. It's because it does. So, however, over the 26 days of the study, they got progressively, both groups had, yes, more improved feelings of unconditional love. That's their report, so it's self-report, so who knows. But they also had improved experience of well-being to the end of the study where they matched. And which I think is really critical and interesting is that the unconditional love mediated the relationship between their relationship to themselves in time and their well-being, which means it looks like unconditional love actually helps your well-being, but because your relationship with time is changing, with yourself over time is changing. We did not test to see if people got more precognitive. We weren't interested in that study, just wanting to improve people's lives. But that is one way you can improve people's lives very simply, is by just teaching them to have a daily habit of connecting with themselves over time. This is something I'll be going through in the Saturday workshop too, is how to develop that daily habit. It's profoundly impactful, even in the morning if you wake up and you say, well, what does my evening self want? What can I give? What gift can I give my going to bed tonight self? Maybe it's just making your bed. Or maybe it's making sure you take time to meditate. Like, what gift are you going to give your going to bed self in the morning? Just that simple habit is profoundly impactful because you start to love yourself over time. Like, I like my going to bed self. Rather than, screw my going to bed self, I'm going to, just have a horrible day and I'll be a disaster and won't be able to sleep tonight, right? Those are two different approaches, but the approach that seems to work for well-being is the one where you actually start to love over time. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, good. I want to go over here to the green person. The green blob with the blue mask.
So, would you describe then promptings you receive as precognitive?
Yeah, I would call those compulsive precognition. So it's very hard to test in a lab because it... Oh, sorry, thanks. Repeating the question. How would you describe promptings that you have? Would you describe them as precognitive? So it's hard to test that in a lab because we know that precognition actually exists. We can say maybe it's the case that when you have these promptings that they're precognitive. We just can't, any spontaneous experience that you have out in the world, we can't know for sure because we haven't run you, 16 times or 60 times or 600 times on a particular task and looked at your statistics, right? But promptings that are sort of out of the ordinary that you don't understand until you understand what happens in the future, you could consider that those would be precognitive promptings. I don't think it would hurt you to consider that,
And the trail of the prompting leading to something or aligning,
And
are they any more or less precognitive?
the question was, does the trail of things leading to or aligning? It really depends on the specific situation, but the real question, the real underlying question is why do you want to know whether that's what is precognitive and what's not? Because if you're thinking that if it's precognitive, it has some kind of value over here, and if it's not precognitive, it has another value over there, that's probably not true. Like precognition is just one way to use your mind, right? So it's more like what works for you, what's gonna help your growth, what's gonna help your well-being, and then just call it that, like call it soup. It doesn't kind of matter, but right. If you want to start developing your precognition consciously, you can take classes in precognitive remote viewing. You can, keep a dream journal. You can do all sorts of things where you're actually developing the conscious component of that, but it doesn't make you any better. It might make you feel better, but it doesn't make you like a better person. It's important we judge ourselves all the time. Anyway, I don't know where that was coming from or if I needed to say that to you or to the rest of the world, but I said that. I didn't mean to. Okay.
Julia, we're just about out of time. Could you just take a moment and explain Saturday?
Sure. Can I answer this one last question? Yeah.
Sure. I actually have two.
You only get one.
What is noetic studies?
Well, that's easy.
And all the questions that were asked made me think of a connection here. The unconditional love component, quantum mechanics, and string theory.
Okay, we are not going to be able to answer that question. I'm out of time. I'm going to answer the first question. The first question is, what are noetics? Institute of Noetic Sciences. Noetic comes from noesis, so it's this Greek word meaning inner wisdom or inner knowing. And so noetic sciences are sciences that are about the inner wisdom or inner knowing. And most of science has focused for the last century on what we can see externally. And people are starting to realize the stuff that's going on inside is super interesting. So that's noetics. In terms of the relationship between quantum mechanics, consciousness, string theory, unconditional love, there's a lot of that. There's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot of that. There are relationships that are easy to think of. But testing those theories ends up being difficult for me. Maybe for someone else can figure out a way to test those theories. So I guess I'm definitely an empiricist. I'm about what can you test, what can we build based on what we know from what we can test to make the world a better place. And when it comes to theory, I was raised by a theoretical physicist, and I would always get irritated because it's like, great theory, I love your math. I'm going to go build something. So, it's like, okay, but that's my bias. And there's some beautiful theories out there. And when I listen to theorists, I'm like, whoa, that's amazing. And I'm stunned. So not to be anti-theory. Saturday is, thanks for all your wonderful questions and also your attention and engagement. It's been amazing. The deal with Saturday is it's a 5-hour intensive workshop. What does that mean? We're going to take a break for lunch, but that's about it. We're going to be doing precognition, precognitive remote viewing training. I'll teach you the first 3 steps of the controlled remote viewing method that was developed in the military in the 80s from some of the stuff that I showed you. And we'll also be talking about developing your relationship with your future self and working on your inner relationship between your system 1 and your system 2. So we'll give them names and figure out how each one wants to work and how we can allow it to work the best, to try to balance that out and boost your relationship with yourself over time in a thoughtful way that's supportive of your development as a person, and that's non-judgmental. So that's the goal. That's the goal. So by the end of the class, you should have some of those experiences. And everyone, if there's more than 13 people, I will have to send you this book, but if 13 people register, all of those people will get a signed copy of this book. And 3 lucky students who are super attentive and are very passionate about getting this book will get a signed copy of the Transcendent Mind, which is the first textbook that I know of from the American Psychological Association that is about consciousness, but does not assume that consciousness is necessarily produced by the brain. So I wrote that with Mosbridge. Thank you, everybody. And I can always talk further with people afterwards, but I'm going to put on my mask once I'm done talking. Thanks.
Thank you.